I'm Marcus Thompson, 47, and I thought I was making the world a better place. After selling my tech company for $120 million, I donated $10 million to Children's Hope Foundation, the largest single donation in their history. The CEO, Sarah Williams, personally thanked me at their gala, tears in her eyes as she spoke about the thousands of children we'd saved together. 6 months later, I discovered those tears were fake. The money I'd given to feed hungry children had funded Sarah's luxury vacations, her daughter's private school tuition, and a beach house in the Hamptons. The betrayal shattered my faith in humanity. But what I uncovered next about Sarah's web of lies would change everything. Not just for the stolen children's future, but for mine. If you've ever trusted someone with your deepest values only to be betrayed, you'll understand why I couldn't let this stand. This is the story of how I learned that sometimes the most generous act is refusing to stay silent. The company's sale agreement sat on my mahogany desk, its pages thick with legal terminology that would change my life forever. $120 million. I stared at the number until it lost all meaning. Just ink on paper representing 15 years of 18-hour days, missed family dinners, and the relentless pursuit of something I couldn't quite name. My parents had immigrated from Poland with nothing but hope and calloused hands. They cleaned office buildings at night, so I could have opportunities they never dreamed of. My father Stanislaw would come home at dawn with stories of the executives whose trash he emptied, men who made more in a day than he earned in a year. Education. Marcus, he'd say in his thick accent, education is the only thing they cannot take from you. I built SecureNet solutions in my garage, developing cybersecurity software that would eventually protect Fortune 500 companies from digital threats. The early years were brutal, surviving on ramen noodles and determination, coding, until my eyes burned, pitching to investors who saw only a young man with more ambition than sense. But I never forgot the gnawing hunger I'd felt as a child when the grocery money ran short, or the shame of wearing the same clothes to school 3 days in a row. Success came gradually, then suddenly. Government contracts, enterprise clients, an IPO that made millionaires of my early employees. Yet the higher I climbed, the more I remembered those nights when my mother would give me her portion of dinner, claiming she wasn't hungry. Food insecurity had shaped my childhood, leaving invisible scars that success couldn't heal. The acquisition offer from Tech Global came at the perfect moment. I was exhausted from running a company that had grown beyond my ability to nurture personally. The corporate machinery that success demanded felt hollow compared to the passion that had driven me to create something meaningful. When I signed those papers, I wasn't just selling a company. I was buying the freedom to address the hunger that had haunted my childhood. The decision to focus on philanthropy wasn't sudden. It had been growing in me for years. Every business, dinner at an expensive restaurant reminded me of my mother's empty plate. Every luxury I could now afford highlighted the arbitrary nature of circumstance. I had won the lottery of birth, timing, and opportunity. Now I had the resources to level the playing field for others. I spent weeks researching children's charities, reading annual reports, studying impact metrics. The statistics were staggering. 820 million people worldwide faced chronic hunger, and children were always the most vulnerable. Malnutrition stunted not just physical growth but cognitive development, trapping generations in cycles of poverty. This wasn't just about feeding hungry stomachs, it was about feeding hungry minds, nurturing human potential that might otherwise be lost. Children's Hope Foundation stood out immediately. Their materials spoke of innovative approaches to childhood, nutrition, sustainable programs that addressed root causes rather than symptoms. Their reported success rates were impressive, their overhead costs reasonable, their mission statement perfectly aligned with my values. Most importantly, they claimed to serve the most vulnerable populations, children in developing nations who had no voice, no advocates, no options. The foundation's literature painted vivid pictures of transformation. Malnourished children growing strong, attending school, breaking free from generational poverty. These weren't just statistics. They were stories of human potential unleashed by something as simple as consistent nutrition. I could almost see my younger self in those faces, understanding intimately how precarious the line between opportunity and desperation could be. As I prepared to make the largest charitable donation of my life, I felt a sense of purpose that had been missing since my early entrepreneurial days. This wasn't about building wealth or achieving recognition. It was about using my success to create opportunities for others. Just as my parents had sacrificed to create opportunities for me, the $10 million represented more than money. It represented hope, possibility, and the belief that one person's success could become another's salvation. Asterisk. The business card felt substantial between my fingers, cream-colored cardstock, with raised lettering that spoke of professionalism and permanence. Sarah Williams, Chief Executive Officer, Children's Hope Foundation. I had collected it 6 months earlier at a philanthropic networking event in Manhattan, never imagining how that simple piece of paper would change my life. The Philanthropy Summit was held at the Plaza Hotel, a gathering of wealthy donors and nonprofit leaders that felt more like a sophisticated cocktail party than a serious discussion about social issues. I had attended reluctantly, still adjusting to my new role as a major philanthropist, rather than a driven entrepreneur. The conversations felt performative, filled with tax advantages and naming opportunities. Rather than genuine concern for the causes being discussed, Sarah stood out immediately. While other nonprofit executives worked the room with practiced charm, she sat quietly at a corner table, reviewing what appeared to be financial documents. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a modest navy dress that looked professional but not expensive. There was something refreshingly authentic about her presence in a room full of carefully curated personas. When she finally took the stage to present about Children's Hope Foundation, the room's energy shifted. Sarah spoke without notes, her voice carrying the weight of personal conviction. She didn't rely on emotional manipulation or shocking statistics, and she painted a picture of systematic change, of addressing root causes rather than symptoms. Hunger isn't just about food, she said, her eyes scanning the audience with quiet intensity. It's about dignity, opportunity, and the fundamental belief that every child deserves a chance to reach their potential. We don't just provide meals, we provide hope. Her presentation was filled with specific examples: solar-powered kitchens in rural villages, nutrition education programs for mothers, sustainable farming initiatives that created local food security. The foundation's approach seemed comprehensive, addressing both immediate needs and long-term solutions. Their reported impact was impressive without being boastful. Thousands of children fed, hundreds of communities transformed, dozens of sustainable programs established. But it was Sarah's personal story that truly captured my attention. She spoke briefly about losing her younger brother, David, to complications from malnutrition when she was 12. Her family had immigrated from Ireland during an economic downturn, and despite her parents' best efforts, there were months when food was scarce. David had been born premature, and his developing immune system couldn't withstand the stress of inconsistent nutrition. He would have been 32 this year, Sarah said quietly. He loved astronomy and wanted to be a scientist. Every child we help represents a David who gets to live, to dream, to contribute to the world in ways we can't imagine. The room fell silent. This wasn't a rehearsed appeal for sympathy. It was a raw, honest explanation of why this work mattered. On a fundamental level, I felt an immediate connection to her story, recognizing echoes of my own childhood struggles with food insecurity. After her presentation, I approached Sarah directly. We talked for nearly an hour, discussing not just her foundation's work, but the broader challenges of effective philanthropy. She was remarkably knowledgeable about global nutrition programs, development, economics, and the cultural factors that influenced successful interventions. Most donors want to write a check and feel good, she told me frankly, but real change requires patience, understanding, and a willingness to support programs that work rather than programs that sound good. Honesty was refreshing. She didn't promise immediate results or oversell her foundation's capabilities. Instead, she spoke about the complexity of addressing systemic problems, the importance of local partnerships, and the need for sustained commitment rather than one-time gestures. Over the following months, Sarah and I met regularly for lunch, discussing everything from supply chain logistics to cultural sensitivity in development work. She invited me to visit the foundation's offices, showed me their operations, introduced me to program directors who spoke passionately about their work in the field. I was impressed by the foundation's transparency, their willingness to discuss both successes and failures, their commitment to evidence-based approaches. Sarah never pressured me for money, never made me feel like a walking checkbook. Instead, she treated me as a partner in addressing problems I cared deeply about. When I finally decided to make my donation, it felt like the natural culmination of months of careful research and growing trust. Sarah had earned my confidence. Through her expertise, her authenticity, and her obvious dedication to the children she served, the business card remained in my wallet, a reminder of the moment when I met someone who seemed to share my deepest values and commitment to making a difference. The check felt insignificant in my hands despite its extraordinary value. $10 million, written in my careful script, made out to Children's Hope Foundation. It was the largest single donation in the organization's 30-year history, and I was about to present it at a ceremony that would change everything, though not in the way I expected. The foundation had organized a special event to accept the donation, held at the Museum of Natural History in New York. The venue was Sarah's choice, she explained, because it represented discovery and wonder, the same qualities she hoped to nurture in the children we would help. The symbolism felt appropriate. I was about to embark on my own journey of discovery, though I couldn't have imagined how dark that path would become. Media representatives filled the front rows, their cameras and recording equipment creating an atmosphere of importance and permanence. This wasn't just a private transaction, it was a public declaration of my commitment to fighting childhood hunger. The foundation's board members sat in the second row, their faces beaming with the satisfaction of securing such a significant gift. Local news stations had sent reporters, and I recognized a journalist from the Wall Street Journal who had covered my company's sale. This donation would make headlines, positioning me as a serious philanthropist rather than just another tech entrepreneur cashing out. The attention made me slightly uncomfortable, but Sarah had convinced me that publicity would inspire other donors to follow suit. My parents sat in the third row, their faces glowing with pride. They had never imagined their son would be in a position to give away more money than they had earned in their entire lives. My father wore his only suit, the one he had bought for my college graduation, and my mother clutched a small purse that had been her luxury purchase after my first successful year in business. Sarah took the podium with the grace of someone accustomed to public speaking, though I now wonder if even that confidence was calculated. She wore a simple black dress that looked elegant but modest, her hair styled professionally but not expensively. Everything about her presentation suggested serious purpose rather than frivolous glamour. Today represents more than a generous donation, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the museum's soaring hall. It represents a partnership between someone who has achieved remarkable success and an organization dedicated to ensuring that success doesn't depend on the accident of birth. She spoke about the foundation's mission, their proven track record, their ambitious plans for expansion. The $10 million would fund comprehensive nutrition programs in 12 countries, reaching an estimated 50,000 children over the next 3 years. The impact would be measurable, sustainable, and transformative. Marcus Thompson understands that true success isn't just about building wealth, it's about building a better world, Sarah continued. His generosity will save lives, nurture minds, and create opportunities for children who deserve the same chances that education and proper nutrition gave him. When she called me to the podium, the applause was warm and sustained. I felt the weight of expectation, the responsibility that came with such a public commitment. My speech was brief but heartfelt, focusing on my parents' sacrifice and my belief that success created an obligation to help others. This donation represents more than money, I said, my voice steady despite my nervousness. It represents hope, that poverty doesn't have to be permanent, that hunger doesn't have to be inevitable, that every child can have the chance to reach their potential. The moment I handed Sarah the check, photographers captured the exchange from every angle. Her eyes filled with tears as she accepted it, her hands trembling slightly as she held the document that would supposedly transform thousands of lives. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. You have no idea how many children will live because of your generosity. The ceremony concluded with a reception where donors and board members mingled, discussing the foundation's future, plans, and the impact this donation would have. Sarah stayed close to me throughout the evening, introducing me to program directors and field workers who spoke passionately about their work. Dr. Patricia Martinez, the foundation's director of international programs, showed me photographs of malnourished children in Guatemala who would benefit from the nutrition programs my donation would fund. The images were heartbreaking but hopeful children whose lives hung in the balance, waiting for the resources that would allow them to grow, learn, and thrive. These children will know your name, Dr. Martinez told me. They'll understand that a stranger cared enough to give them a chance at life. As the evening wound down, Sarah pulled me aside for a private moment. I want you to know that this isn't just about the money, she said softly. It's about what your donation represents, the belief that we can actually solve these problems. If we're willing to commit to the work, she promised regular updates on the programs my donation would fund, detailed reports on impact and outcomes, and opportunities to visit the communities where the work was being done. The foundation's commitment to transparency and accountability was part of what had attracted me to their mission. Driving home that night, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The check was just the beginning of a partnership that would save lives and create opportunities for children who deserved better. I had used my success to address problems that had shaped my own childhood, closing a circle that connected my parents' struggle to children on the other side of the world. The newspaper coverage the next day was extensive and positive. The headlines proclaimed my donation as a model for other successful entrepreneurs, and the articles emphasized the foundation's impressive track record and ambitious goals. I was portrayed as a thoughtful philanthropist who had done his research and chosen his cause carefully. Little did I know that every word of praise, every assumption about my careful vetting, every confident prediction about the lives that would be saved, was built on a foundation of lies that would soon crumble beneath the weight of truth. Asterisk, the foundation's monthly newsletter arrived like clockwork, its glossy pages filled with success stories that made my heart swell with pride. Each issue featured photographs of healthy, smiling children, alongside detailed reports of the programs my donation had funded. The March edition showed a school in Kenya where 300 children now received daily meals, their academic performance improving dramatically with proper nutrition. Sarah had been true to her word about transparency. The reports were comprehensive, showing not just the number of children served but the measurable outcomes of the programs. Test scores increased, school attendance improved, and health indicators showed consistent progress. The foundation's approach seemed to be working exactly as promised. As the foundation's largest donor, I had been invited to join their advisory board, a role that gave me unprecedented access to their operations and decision-making processes. The monthly board meetings were held in a conference room overlooking Central Park, where I sat alongside other successful philanthropists, business leaders, and development experts. The board members were impressive: Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a former World Health Organization official; Robert Sterling, a retired investment banker who had dedicated his later years to education reform; and Margaret Walsh, whose family foundation had been fighting poverty for 3 generations. These weren't casual donors writing checks for tax benefits. They were serious people who understood the complexities of international development. During board meetings, Sarah would present detailed program updates, financial reports, and strategic plans for expansion. The foundation's work was expanding beyond nutrition to include education, healthcare, and economic development. My donation had catalyzed a period of unprecedented growth, allowing them to hire additional staff, expand to new countries, and develop innovative approaches to poverty alleviation. The April newsletter featured a 2-page spread about a sustainable farming initiative in Bangladesh that was teaching families to grow nutritious vegetables while improving soil quality. The program had reached 15,000 families, creating food security while generating income through surplus crops sold at local markets. The photograph showed farmers proudly displaying their harvests, children helping tend family gardens, and communities working together to build irrigation systems. My reputation in philanthropic circles grew rapidly. I was invited to speak at conferences, join the boards of other organizations, and participate in donor networks focused on childhood development. The recognition felt good, but more importantly, it seemed to validate my approach to philanthropy: careful research, strategic thinking, and long-term commitment rather than impulsive giving. The foundation's annual gala in May was a spectacular event that raised an additional $2.3 million from other donors inspired by my initial commitment. The ballroom at the Waldorf Astoria was filled with New York's philanthropic elite, all celebrating the foundation's remarkable growth and impact. Sarah delivered a keynote address that brought many guests to tears. She spoke about visiting a village in Somalia where children had been dying from malnutrition before the foundation's intervention. Now, she reported, the village had a thriving school, a medical clinic, and a cooperative that produced nutritious food for the entire community. When Marcus Thompson made his extraordinary donation, Sarah said, gesturing toward me in the audience, he didn't just give money, he gave hope. Tonight, thousands of children are sleeping peacefully because one person decided that their lives mattered. The standing ovation was thunderous, and I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what success was supposed to feel like: not the empty accumulation of wealth, but the meaningful application of resources to solve real problems. The foundation's work was my legacy, the way I would be remembered long after the company I had built was forgotten. Between formal board meetings, Sarah and I developed a closer working relationship. She would call me directly to discuss opportunities for expansion, challenges in program implementation, and strategic decisions about the foundation's future. I appreciated her willingness to seek my input, treating me as a partner rather than just a donor. During one of our regular lunch meetings, Sarah shared her vision for creating a model that other foundations could replicate. The success of our programs had attracted attention from development organizations worldwide, and she was being invited to speak at international conferences about sustainable approaches to childhood nutrition. Your donation didn't just help children, she told me over lunch at a quiet restaurant near her office. It proved that properly funded, well-managed programs can actually solve these problems. We're not just treating symptoms anymore, addressing root causes. The June newsletter featured a special section about the foundation's growing influence in development circles. Academic researchers were studying their programs, government officials were adopting their approaches, and other foundations were requesting consultation about replicating their success. My donation had created a ripple effect that was changing how the entire development community thought about fighting poverty. I began planning an even larger donation for the following year. The foundation's track record was impeccable, their impact was measurable, and their approach was innovative. Sarah had earned my complete trust through consistent results and transparent reporting. I was prepared to commit another $15 million to expand their programs to additional countries. The foundation's summer fundraising campaign exceeded all expectations, raising nearly $5 million from donors who cited my example as inspiration for their own giving. The campaign materials featured testimonials from field workers, government officials, and community leaders who praised the foundation's effectiveness and professionalism. By August, the foundation was serving over 75,000 children across 14 countries, with plans to reach 100,000 by the end of the year. The scale of impact was extraordinary, validating my belief that significant problems required significant resources, backed by sophisticated management and evidence-based approaches. I felt proud of my role in the foundation's success, But more importantly, I felt satisfied that my parents' sacrifice had led to something meaningful. The immigrant work ethic that had driven my entrepreneurial success was now feeding hungry children and creating opportunities for families trapped in poverty. It was a perfect circle of generosity and impact. The September newsletter would be the last one I would read with uncomplicated joy. Hidden within its glossy pages and inspiring stories were the same lies that had been carefully constructed from the beginning. Lies so sophisticated that even experienced philanthropists and development experts had been completely deceived. The foundation I thought I knew was about to reveal itself as something far more sinister than I could have imagined. The credit card statement lay face up on Sarah's desk, its details clearly visible when I entered her office for our scheduled meeting about the foundation's quarterly report. It was a carelessly left document that would shatter my world, though I didn't realize it at the time. I had arrived 10 minutes early for our appointment, and Sarah's assistant had waved me into the office while Sarah finished a phone call in the hallway. This statement was positioned directly in front of the guest chair where I always sat. Impossible to ignore as I waited for her return. The letterhead read, Children's Hope Foundation corporate account, but the charges told a different story entirely. Four Seasons Resort Maui, $8,347. Le Bernardine, New York, $1,205. Tiffany & Co., $3,890. Horace Mann School tuition payment, $15,650. Each line item felt like a small betrayal. Though I struggled to understand what I was seeing, my business background had taught me to process financial information quickly, and the pattern became obvious within seconds. These weren't legitimate foundation expenses, they were personal purchases charged to the organization's credit card. The amounts were staggering, representing more than many families earned in a year. Sarah returned to her office just as I finished scanning the statement. Her phone call apparently concluded. Her face went pale when she saw what I had been looking at, and she quickly moved to cover the document with a folder. Marcus, I'm so sorry you had to see that, she said, her voice carrying a note of embarrassment. Our accountant has been trying to sort out some billing errors from our credit card company. You know how these corporate accounts can get mixed up. Her explanation felt hollow, but I wanted to believe it. The alternative that the foundation's CEO was using charity funds for personal expenses was too disturbing to consider seriously. I had invested too much trust, too much hope, too much of my reputation in this organization. Billing errors? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. The Maui resort charge was from the same week Sarah had told the board she was conducting site visits in Central America. The private school tuition was particularly troubling, as Sarah had never mentioned having children. The credit card company somehow merged our personal account with the foundation's corporate account, she explained, her hands fidgeting with the papers on her desk. We've been fighting with them for weeks to get it sorted out. It's incredibly frustrating, but you know how bureaucratic these financial institutions can be. The explanation had the surface plausibility that comes from practice, but something felt fundamentally wrong. The charges weren't random, they showed a pattern of luxury spending that seemed inconsistent with Sarah's modest lifestyle and the foundation's mission. More troubling was her obvious discomfort with my having seen the document. I hope you get it resolved quickly, I said carefully. These kinds of accounting mix-ups can create serious problems during audits. Oh, absolutely, Sarah replied quickly. Our auditors are already aware of the situation, and we're documenting everything for the credit card company. It should be resolved within the next billing cycle. She moved quickly to change the subject, pulling out the quarterly report we were supposed to discuss. The document was as impressive as always: detailed program updates, measurable outcomes, inspiring photographs of children whose lives had been transformed by the foundation's work. But I found it difficult to focus on the content, while the image of that credit card statement burned in my memory. The Horace Mann school charge was particularly disturbing. I knew the school's reputation as one of New York's most exclusive private institutions, with annual tuition exceeding $50,000. If Sarah had a child attending such an expensive school, it raised questions about her personal financial situation and potential conflicts of interest. Throughout our meeting, I studied Sarah's behavior more carefully than ever before. She seemed nervous, occasionally stumbling over details that she had previously discussed with confidence. Her explanations about program expansion were precise, but her body language suggested someone under stress. After leaving her office, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The credit card statement kept intruding on my thoughts, each line item representing a violation of the trust I had placed in the foundation. The charges weren't small mistakes or administrative errors. They were significant expenses that suggested systematic misuse of charity funds. That evening, I tried to research the credit card company's policies about account mergers, hoping to find information that would support Sarah's explanation. The more I learned about corporate credit card management, the less plausible her story became. Financial institutions had strict protocols precisely to prevent the kind of mixing she described. I also researched Horace Mann School, discovering that their tuition payment schedule didn't match the timing Sarah had described for resolving the billing error. If this was truly a mistake, it had been ongoing for months without resolution, which seemed inconsistent with the foundation's otherwise meticulous financial management. The doubt that began that afternoon grew slowly but steadily. I found myself paying closer attention to foundation communications, looking for inconsistencies or signs of the problems I hoped I hadn't actually discovered. The trust that had developed over months of collaboration was beginning to crack, replaced by a nagging suspicion that I might have been catastrophically wrong about the organization I had supported so generously. I knew I needed more information before drawing any conclusions, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. The credit card statement represented either an innocent administrative error or evidence of serious fraud. Over the coming weeks, I would discover which interpretation was correct, though the truth would prove far worse than my darkest suspicions. My cybersecurity background had taught me that the truth usually lived in the data, hidden beneath layers of obfuscation that could be penetrated with the right tools and persistence. The credit card statement I had glimpsed in Sarah's office was just the visible tip of what I suspected was a much larger iceberg of deception. Late that night in my home office, I began the methodical process of digital investigation that had served me well during my years building SecureNet solutions. If the foundation was misusing donor funds, there would be evidence, financial records, transaction patterns, and digital footprints that could reveal the full scope of any fraud. I started with publicly available information, accessing the foundation's tax filings through the IRS database. Form 990s were required to disclose executive compensation, major expenses, and program costs for all charitable organizations. What I found in the foundation's most recent filing was disturbing but not conclusive. Sarah's reported compensation was $125,000 annually, modest for a nonprofit CEO managing a multi-million-dollar organization. However, the filing showed unusually high categories for travel and conferences and professional services that could potentially hide personal expenses disguised as legitimate business costs. The foundation's bank was listed as Metropolitan Trust, an institution I had worked with during my corporate years. I remembered their executive vice president, James Morrison, from several business deals where his expertise in corporate financial analysis had been invaluable. After some internal debate, I decided to reach out to him. "Marcus, good to hear from you," James said when I called the next morning. "Congratulations on your philanthropic work. I saw the coverage of your donation to Children's Hope Foundation. Very impressive." "That's actually why I'm calling," I said carefully. "I'm doing some due diligence on the foundation's financial management, and I was hoping you might be able to provide some general insights about their banking relationship." There was a pause. "I can't discuss specific account details, of course, but I can tell you that their financial activity has been interesting. Complex transaction patterns, multiple accounts, frequent large transfers between entities. It's the kind of activity that generates internal compliance reviews." "Compliance reviews?" I asked, my suspicion growing stronger. "Nothing actionable so far, but unusual enough to warrant monitoring." "Look, Marcus, I probably shouldn't be saying this, but if you're considering additional donations, you might want to conduct a thorough financial audit first." His warning confirmed my growing concerns. I thanked him and hung up, knowing I needed to dig deeper. Using techniques I had developed during my cybersecurity work, I began tracing the foundation's digital footprint, looking for connections between their official accounts and any personal accounts that might reveal misappropriation. The foundation's website listed their primary business address, but property records showed the building was owned by a shell company called Charitable Properties, LLC. When I researched that entity, I discovered it was registered to Sarah Williams at a residential address in Westchester County, a $2.3 million home. That seemed inconsistent with her reported nonprofit salary. I cross-referenced property purchase date with the foundation's financial records and discovered something troubling. The house had been purchased 18 months earlier, just 3 months after the foundation had received a $3.5 million grant from a major family foundation, money that was supposed to fund nutrition programs in sub-Saharan Africa. The investigation became an obsession. I spent hours each night following financial threads, mapping connections between the foundation's reported activities and Sarah's personal finances. What emerged was a pattern of systematic theft, disguised as legitimate business expenses. Bank records I obtained through legitimate channels showed that my $10 million donation had been immediately transferred to multiple accounts, creating a complex web of transactions designed to obscure the money's ultimate destination. Significant portions had been moved to accounts controlled by Sarah personally, while other amounts had been transferred to shell companies that appeared to exist solely to launder charitable funds. The most damning evidence came from corporate credit card records that I accessed through my business relationship with the credit card company. The billing error Sarah had described was actually a pattern of personal charges dating back over 2 years. Luxury vacations, expensive restaurants, private school tuition, home renovations, and high-end shopping, all funded by money donated to feed hungry children. I discovered that Sarah's daughter Emma was indeed enrolled at Horace Mann School, with tuition payments totaling over $150,000 during the past 3 years. The payments came directly from foundation accounts, disguised in financial reports as educational program consultancy fees. Similar deceptions were used to justify other personal expenses. Her Maui vacation was listed as a donor cultivation retreat, and her Tiffany purchases were categorized as donor appreciation gifts. The scope of the fraud was breathtaking. Over the past 4 years, Sarah had stolen at least $8 million from the foundation, using increasingly sophisticated methods to hide the theft. My donation hadn't been the first to be misappropriated, was simply the largest single theft in an ongoing criminal enterprise. Most devastating was the realization that the programs I thought I was funding didn't exist. The nutrition initiatives in Kenya, the farming cooperatives in Bangladesh, the medical clinics in Somalia, they were all fictional, supported by fabricated reports and staged photographs. Thousands of children I believed were being fed were still hungry, still dying, still trapped in poverty, while Sarah lived in luxury funded by their supposed salvation. The evidence I had gathered was overwhelming, but I knew I needed more before confronting Sarah or involving law enforcement. The financial records showed clear patterns of fraud, but I needed documentation that would be admissible in court and sufficient to recover the stolen funds. As I prepared for the next phase of my investigation, I felt a complex mixture of anger, betrayal, and determination. The woman I had trusted with my deepest values had exploited that trust to fund a lifestyle of luxury while children remained hungry. The foundation I had believed was changing the world was actually perpetuating the very problems it claimed to solve. But anger was giving way to resolve. I had the skills, resources, and evidence necessary to expose this fraud and bring Sarah to justice. The children who should have been helped deserved nothing less than the complete truth, regardless of how painful that truth might prove to be. Sarah's Instagram account was set to private, but a mutual connection from the philanthropic community had unknowingly provided me access when she accepted my follow request months earlier. What I discovered in her carefully curated social media presence would provide the final devastating proof of her betrayal. The photos were organized by location, each album documenting luxury vacations that corresponded exactly with the fraudulent credit card charges I had uncovered. The Four Seasons Maui album contained 43 photos spanning a week in February. The same week, Sarah had told the board she was conducting site visits in Guatemala to monitor our nutrition programs. Thought the images were stunning and incriminating. Sarah lounging by an infinity pool with champagne, her daughter Emma building sandcastles on a pristine beach, elaborate meals at restaurants I recognized from the foundation's expense reports. The timestamps on the photos matched perfectly with the charges I had found, creating an irrefutable timeline of theft and deception. But it was the caption on one particular photo that truly enraged me. Sarah had posted a sunset image from her Maui balcony with the text, "Grateful for life's blessings and the opportunity to make a difference in the world. Sometimes we need these moments of peace to recharge for the important work ahead. #blessed, #grateful, #children's hope." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. She was literally celebrating her theft of money intended for hungry children, using hashtags that referenced the very foundation she was defrauding. The important work she mentioned was nothing more than elaborate lies designed to steal more money from trusting donors. I scrolled through months of posts, finding a consistent pattern of luxury experiences funded by charitable donations. A Paris vacation in May had been disguised as attendance at an international development conference. The photos showed Sarah and Emma at the Louvre, dining at Michelin-starred restaurants, and shopping on the Champs-Élysées, activities that bore no resemblance to the humanitarian work she claimed to be conducting. The European trip had cost the foundation over $25,000, money that was supposed to fund a water purification system for a village in Kenya. According to the foundation's reports, that system was saving hundreds of lives by providing clean drinking water. In reality, the village didn't exist, and the money had funded Sarah's vacation wardrobe and her daughter's private shopping spree. More disturbing were the posts where Sarah used her daughter as a prop for the foundation's work. Several photos showed Emma holding stuffed animals or toys, with captions about teaching the next generation to care about children in need. The irony was, cruel Sarah was teaching her daughter that stealing from children was acceptable as long as you could craft compelling narratives about helping them. The most damaging album contained photos from a Christmas vacation in the Hamptons. Sarah had rented a beachfront mansion for the holidays, hosting an elaborate party that included several foundation board members. The rental costs $18,000 for 2 weeks, charged to the foundation as a strategic planning retreat. I recognized several faces from the party photos board members who had approved my donation, staff members who had presented fabricated program reports, and donors who had been deceived just as thoroughly as I had been. The casualness of their celebration while discussing stolen money was chilling evidence of how systemic the corruption had become. The vacation photos revealed something even more disturbing than simple theft. They showed a woman who genuinely enjoyed the luxury that stolen money provided. This wasn't desperate embezzlement driven by financial crisis. It was calculated, systematic theft motivated by greed and enabled by the trust of people who genuinely wanted to help children. Sarah's posts from various charity events were particularly galling. She would attend galas and fundraisers, posing with other philanthropists and posting inspirational quotes about service and sacrifice. One photo from a UNICEF benefit showed her wearing a $15,000 dress, charged to the foundation as a professional wardrobe expense while posting about the importance of supporting children's causes. The comments on her posts were filled with praise from people who believed they were supporting a dedicated humanitarian. Board members congratulated her on her tireless work. Other donors expressed admiration for her commitment, and supporters shared their own stories of wanting to help vulnerable children. Each positive comment represented another person whose trust and good intentions were being exploited. I found myself studying Emma's face in the vacation photos, wondering what Sarah had told her daughter about their lifestyle. Did a teenager understand that her private school tuition and luxury vacations were funded by money stolen from hungry children? Was she complicit in the deception, or was she another victim of her mother's fraud? The Instagram evidence was overwhelming, but it also provided the documentation I needed to build a compelling case against Sarah. The photos were time-stamped and geotagged, creating an undeniable record of her activities during periods when she claimed to be conducting foundation business. The luxury she displayed was clearly inconsistent with her reported income and the foundation's mission. As I compiled screenshots and documented the connections between Sarah's social media posts and the foundation's financial records, I felt a profound sense of betrayal that went beyond the stolen money. She had weaponized my desire to help children, exploiting my personal history of food insecurity to manipulate me into funding her greed. But the vacation photos also strengthened my resolve to seek justice. Every image of Sarah enjoying luxury while children remained hungry was motivation to ensure that her crimes were exposed and punished. The evidence was clear, compelling, and damaging enough to destroy both her freedom and her reputation. The children who should have been helped deserved justice. The donors who had been deceived deserved truth. And Sarah deserved the consequences of her systematic betrayal of everything the foundation claimed to represent. The vacation photos would play a central role in ensuring that justice was served, regardless of how long the legal process might take. The foundation's impact reports had always impressed me with their detailed documentation and measurable outcomes. Now, armed with evidence of Sarah's fraud, I began examining those reports with the skeptical eye of a cybersecurity expert looking for vulnerabilities. What I discovered was a masterpiece of deception so elaborate it could have served as a textbook case study in sophisticated fraud. The October 2023 Impact Report claimed that my donation had established nutrition programs serving 12,000 children across 6 countries. The document was beautifully designed, filled with compelling photographs, detailed statistics, and heartwarming testimonials from supposed beneficiaries. Every element appeared legitimate until I began verifying the details with investigative techniques I had learned during my corporate years. I started by reverse searching the photographs using Google Images, a simple technique that would reveal if the foundation was using stock photos or images from other organizations. The results were devastating. The photograph labeled "Children Receiving Nutritious Meals in Our Kenya Program" was actually a stock image from a World Vision publication about their programs in Ethiopia. The image had been cropped and edited to remove identifying watermarks. Systematic analysis revealed that every photograph in the foundation's reports was stolen from legitimate humanitarian organizations. Images from Save the Children, UNICEF, World Food Program, and dozens of smaller nonprofits had been rebranded as evidence of the foundation's work. The theft wasn't random. Sarah had carefully selected photos that matched her fabricated program descriptions, creating convincing visual narratives for entirely fictional initiatives. The GPS coordinates provided for program locations led to empty fields, abandoned buildings, or non-existent addresses. The nutrition center in Bangladesh that supposedly served 3,000 children was located at coordinates that placed it in the middle of the Bay of Bengal. The farming cooperative in Guatemala was positioned in an uninhabited mountain region with no road access. Even more sophisticated was the creation of fake testimonials and program evaluations. The foundation's reports included quotes from supposed beneficiaries, local officials, and partner organizations that had been entirely fabricated. Maria Santos, described as a mother of 3 whose children had been saved by the foundation's programs, didn't exist. The quotes attributed to her were actually plagiarized from genuine testimonials from other organizations. Publications. Sarah had created fictional partner organizations with professional-looking websites, complete with staff directories, program descriptions, and contact information. International development partners. Supposedly the foundation's primary implementation partner in East Africa was entirely fictional. Their website had been created using templates and stock photos, designed to appear legitimate during superficial research but containing no actual substance. The financial documentation supporting the impact reports was equally fraudulent. Bank transferred records showing money sent to fund programs had actually moved funds between accounts controlled by Sarah herself. The field office operational costs were payments to shell companies she had created, and the local staff salaries were deposits into personal accounts belonging to Sarah and her associates. I discovered that Sarah had established an entire ecosystem of fake entities to support her fraud. Charitable Properties LLC was just one of 7 shell companies she controlled, each with official registrations, bank accounts, and professional facades. The companies had names like Global Nutrition Solutions, Children's Development Associates, and International Hunger Relief, all designed to sound like legitimate nonprofit partners. The auditing firm that had supposedly verified the foundation's financial records was also fake. Morrison & Associates, certified public accountants, existed only as a website and registered business name. The audit reports bearing their seal were fabricated documents, designed to provide credibility for the foundation's fraudulent financial statements. Most disturbing was discovering that my donation wasn't the foundation's first major theft. Sarah had been operating this fraud for over 6 years, stealing from dozens of donors who believed they were saving children's lives. The total amount stolen exceeded $30 million, making this one of the largest charity fraud schemes in recent history. The pattern was always the same. Sarah would identify wealthy donors with personal connections to the causes she claimed to address, research their backgrounds to understand their emotional triggers, then craft personalized appeals that would maximize their donations. She had targeted recent widows whose husbands had supported children's causes, successful immigrants who felt obligated to help others, and parents who had lost children to preventable diseases. Each donor received the same sophisticated treatment. I had experienced carefully staged meetings, emotional presentations, fabricated impact reports, and invitations to join the foundation's inner circle. The personal attention made donors feel valued and important while blinding them to the systematic theft of their generosity. The foundation's board of directors included several unwitting participants who genuinely believed in the organization's mission. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the former WHO official, had been recruited specifically because her credentials would provide credibility for the foundation's health programs. She had never actually visited any program sites or independently verified the foundation's claims. She had simply trusted Sarah's reports and expertise. Asterisk, however, some board members were clearly complicit in the fraud. Robert Sterling, the retired investment banker, had helped create the shell companies and offshore accounts used to launder stolen funds. His financial expertise had been essential in developing the sophisticated systems that allowed Sarah to steal millions while maintaining an appearance of legitimate operations. The investigation revealed that even the foundation's office was part of the deception. The impressive Manhattan headquarters was leased space that had been furnished with expensive artwork and furniture purchased with stolen donations. The program staff I had met during board meetings were actors hired to play roles during important donor visits. As I documented the full scope of Sarah's fraud, I felt a mixture of rage and admiration for the sheer audacity of the scheme. She had created an entire fictional universe of charitable work, complete with fake organizations, fabricated reports, stolen photographs, and convincing testimonials. The level of planning and execution was extraordinary, even as it was completely evil. But the evidence I had gathered was also comprehensive enough to destroy Sarah's carefully constructed lies. The stolen photographs, fake GPS coordinates, fabricated testimonials, and shell company documentation created an overwhelming case that no defense attorney could reasonably dispute. The children who should have been helped would finally get justice, even if they would never receive the aid that had been stolen from them. The web of deception was complete, but so was my investigation. I now had everything needed to expose Sarah's crimes and begin the long process of seeking justice for the thousands of children whose lives she had stolen through her systematic betrayal of human compassion. Asterisk, I spent 3 sleepless nights planning the confrontation with Sarah, knowing I would have only one opportunity to get her admission on record before she realized the full extent of my investigation. The recording device hidden in my jacket pocket felt heavier than its actual weight, carrying the hopes of every deceived donor and every child who should have been helped. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning under the pretense of discussing my planned additional donation of $15 million. Sarah had been eager to arrange the appointment, no doubt anticipating another massive theft disguised as charitable giving. Her enthusiasm for the meeting would prove to be her downfall. I arrived at the foundation's offices 30 minutes early, using the time to activate the recording device and review my strategy one final time. The confrontation needed to be careful and controlled, aggressive enough to provoke admissions but subtle enough to avoid alerting her to the criminal investigation. I was preparing to launch. Sarah greeted me with her usual warm smile, wearing what I now recognized as another expensive outfit purchased with stolen donations. Her enthusiasm was palpable as she led me into her office, clearly excited about the prospect of stealing another fortune from my misplaced trust. "Marcus, I can't tell you how thrilled I am about your decision to increase your support," she began. settling into her chair with the confidence of someone who believed her deception was undetectable. The programs you've already funded are showing remarkable results, and expanding them will save even more lives. I had prepared for this moment, but hearing her speak casually about fabricated programs, while planning to steal more money, still triggered a surge of anger that I struggled to control. The children she claimed to be helping were still hungry, still dying, while she planned luxury vacations funded by my generosity. Before we discuss the new donation, I wanted to review the impact of my previous gift, I said carefully. I've been doing some research into the programs, and I have a few questions about the implementation. Sarah's expression didn't change, but I noticed her hands tighten slightly around her coffee cup. Of course, she replied smoothly. I'm always happy to discuss our work in detail. What specifically would you like to know? I pulled out printed copies of several impact reports, placing them on her desk where she could see them clearly. The nutrition program in Kenya has been particularly impressive, I said. Could you tell me more about the specific location where we're serving those 3,000 children? Absolutely, Sarah responded without hesitation. The program is centered in Kibora, working with local community leaders to provide daily meals and nutrition, education. The transformation has been remarkable. We've seen dramatic improvements in health outcomes and school attendance. The lie was delivered with such confidence that I almost questioned my own investigation. But I knew the GPS coordinates for the supposed program location, placed it in an uninhabited area hundreds of miles from Kibora. Sarah was improvising details for a program that existed only in fabricated reports. I'd love to visit the program during my next trip to Africa, I said, watching her reaction carefully. Could you provide me with contact information for your local staff? For the first time, Sarah hesitated. Well, that's a bit complicated right now, she said slowly. We're in the middle of transitioning our field operations to new local partners. I'd need to check with our program director about the best timing. For a visit, I pressed harder. What about the farming cooperative in Bangladesh? The reports show incredible success with their sustainable agriculture programs. I'm particularly interested in seeing their irrigation systems. Sarah's confidence was beginning to crack. The Bangladesh program is also going through some transitions, she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor. Political instability in the region has made it difficult to maintain consistent communication with our partners. The excuses were becoming more elaborate and less plausible. I decided it was time to reveal some of what I had discovered. Sarah, I need to ask you directly about some financial irregularities I've noticed. Her face went pale, but she maintained her composure. What kind of irregularities? I placed the credit card statement I had photographed on her desk. This shows charges for personal expenses on the foundation's corporate credit card. The Maui vacation, the private school tuition, the luxury shopping, these don't appear to be legitimate foundation expenses. Sarah stared at the statement for a long moment before responding. I can explain all of those charges, she said, though her voice lacked its previous confidence. The Maui trip was a donor cultivation event, and the school expenses were for educational consultancy work Emma was doing for our programs. The explanations were obviously false, and we both knew it. I could see the calculation in her eyes as she tried to determine how much I had discovered and whether she could still salvage the situation. Sarah, I know about the shell companies, I said quietly. I know about the fake program reports, the stolen photographs, the fabricated testimonials. I know that none of the programs I funded actually exist. The confession hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. Sarah's carefully constructed facade finally cracked, revealing the desperation underneath. She slumped in her chair, her hands trembling as she realized the full scope of her exposure. You don't understand, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It started small, just borrowing against future donations to cover cash flow problems. I always intended to pay it back. $28 million isn't a cash flow problem, I replied. It's systematic theft from children who are dying while you live in luxury. Sarah's composure completely collapsed. I never meant for it to get this big, she sobbed. But once it started, I couldn't stop. The board expected results, donors wanted impact reports, and I couldn't admit that the programs weren't working. So you decided to steal instead of seeking help? I was protecting the foundation's reputation, she said desperately. If donors found out about the initial problems, they would have stopped giving, and then no children would have been helped at all. The rationalization was breathtaking in its self-deception. Sarah had convinced herself that stealing millions was somehow better than admitting to management problems. Her twisted logic had allowed her to justify years of theft while portraying herself as a dedicated humanitarian. What about my $10 million? I asked. Where is that money now? Sarah's tears were flowing freely as she responded. Some of it went to legitimate expenses, she said weakly. But most of it's gone. The house, Emma's school, the vacations, the lifestyle we built. I can't give it back because I don't have it anymore. The admission was complete and damaging. Sarah had confessed to stealing my donation, acknowledged that the programs didn't exist, and admitted that the money was gone. The recording device in my pocket had captured everything. creating evidence that would be crucial for both criminal prosecution and civil recovery efforts. As I stood to leave, Sarah made one final desperate appeal. "Marcus, please," she begged, "think about what exposing this will do to all the other donors, to the Foundation's other programs, to my daughter. Can't we work something out privately?" I looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. Even faced with complete exposure, she was still trying to manipulate my emotions to escape consequences for her crimes. The woman I had trusted with my deepest values had revealed herself to be utterly without conscience or remorse. "The only thing I'm thinking about," I said quietly, "are the thousands of children who are still hungry because you stole their food money to fund your luxury lifestyle. They deserve justice, even if they'll never get the help you promised them." I left Sarah's office knowing that the confrontation phase of my investigation was complete. The recording would provide prosecutors with direct evidence of her crimes, and the documentation I had gathered would support a comprehensive criminal case. A long process of seeking justice was about to begin, but the hardest part, learning the truth about someone I had trusted completely, was finally over. The board meeting minutes I obtained through a legal document request revealed a conspiracy far broader than Sarah's individual crimes. Hidden within the bureaucratic language of monthly reports and financial discussions was evidence that several board members had knowingly participated in the fraud, transforming what I had believed was Sarah's personal betrayal into a systematic, criminal enterprise. The March 2023 minutes contained a telling exchange buried in routine business. Robert Sterling, the retired investment banker who had impressed me with his financial acumen, had raised questions about donation allocation strategies and offshore operational efficiency. Reading between the lines of corporate euphemisms, it was clear he was helping Sarah develop more sophisticated methods for laundering stolen funds. Margaret Walsh, whose family foundation had been fighting poverty for generations, had proposed creating subsidiary operational entities to maximize program flexibility. The innocent-sounding language actually described the shell company network that allowed Sarah to move money between accounts while maintaining plausible documentation for auditors and donors. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the former HOOF official whose credentials had provided medical legitimacy for the Foundation's nutrition programs, had been more directly complicit than I initially realized. The minutes showed her actively participating in discussions about program outcome, documentation, and impact measurement protocols, conversations that were actually about creating more convincing fake reports. The board members' compensation revealed another layer of corruption. While their positions were supposedly volunteer roles, financial records showed significant consulting fees paid to companies controlled by each board member. Sterling's financial consulting firm had received $340,000 over 2 years for strategic planning services. Walsh's family foundation had received $150,000 for program development assistance. Chen had been paid $200,000 for medical advisory services. The payments created a clear motive for their participation in Sarah's fraud. They weren't just enablers who had been deceived, they were active participants who had been richly compensated for their complicity. Their prestigious credentials and philanthropic reputations had provided cover for the theft while they personally profited from the criminal enterprise. The most damning evidence came from email communications I accessed through my corporate relationships with the Foundation's technology providers. The messages, which the board members had assumed were private, revealed their awareness of the fraud and their active participation in covering it up. A particularly incriminating email chain from June 2023 discussed my planned additional donation of $15 million. Sterling had written, "We need to ensure the documentation for this allocation is particularly thorough given the donor's technical background." Walsh had replied, "Agreed. Marcus has the skills to detect irregularities if we're not careful." Chen had contributed to the conversation by suggesting we should emphasize the medical outcomes in our reporting to him. His personal history with food insecurity makes him particularly responsive to health-focused narratives. The clinical calculation of their manipulation was breathtaking. They had studied my psychological vulnerabilities to more effectively steal from me. The board members had even discussed contingency plans for managing discovery of the fraud. Sterling had proposed creating documentation trails that would support alternative explanations for fund transfers, while Walsh had suggested identifying fallback positions that would minimize exposure for board members. They had been planning their defense while actively participating in the crime. Their communications revealed the systematic nature of their targeting of major donors. I wasn't their first victim. They had refined their approach through previous fraudulent schemes, involving at least 8 other significant donors over the past 4 years. Each donor had been carefully researched, psychologically profiled, and methodically deceived using techniques the board had developed and perfected. The targeting criteria were chillingly specific. They focused on successful entrepreneurs who had recently sold businesses, individuals with personal connections to childhood poverty or hunger, and donors who were new to philanthropy and lacked experience with nonprofit due diligence. My profile had matched their preferred victim characteristics perfectly. The board had developed detailed personas for each major donor, documenting their emotional triggers, financial capacity, and social connections. My file contained notes about my parents' immigration story, my childhood food insecurity, and my desire to address hunger as a way of honoring their sacrifice. They had weaponized my most personal motivations to facilitate their theft. Margaret Walsh's role was particularly disturbing because her family's legitimate philanthropic history provided credibility that other board members lacked. Her great-grandfather had established the Walsh Foundation in 1923, and the family had genuinely supported education and poverty relief for nearly a century. Margaret's participation in fraud represented a betrayal not just of donors like me, but of her own family's legacy. The investigation revealed that the board members had been stealing from their own legitimate foundations as well. Walsh had diverted over $2 million from her family foundation to support the Children's Hope fraud, violating her fiduciary duties to her own donors and beneficiaries. Sterling had used his position on 3 other nonprofit boards to identify potential victims for similar schemes. Their personal financial records showed the lifestyle inflation that had resulted from their criminal profits. Sterling had purchased a $3.8 million vacation home in the Hamptons, while Walsh had renovated her Park Avenue apartment at a cost of $1.2 million. Chen had paid for her children's graduate school tuition and established trust funds for her grandchildren, all funded by money stolen from charitable donations. The scope of their betrayal extended beyond financial crimes to include the destruction of legitimate charitable work. Their actions had not only stolen money from specific donors, but had damaged public confidence in nonprofit organizations generally. Every dollar they stole represented reduced funding for legitimate charities, addressing real problems, as I documented. The board members' complicity had felt a deeper level of betrayal than I had experienced, even when discovering Sarah's fraud. These were people whose reputations and credentials had been essential to my decision to trust the foundation. Their participation transformed my narrative from a story about one bad actor to a revelation about systemic corruption among supposedly trusted leaders. The evidence against the board members was comprehensive and damaging. Their email communications provided direct proof of their knowledge and participation, while their financial records showed clear benefits from the criminal enterprise. The compensation they had received, the lifestyle improvements they had funded, and the systematic nature of their targeting created an overwhelming case for conspiracy charges, but their crimes also strengthened my resolve to seek complete justice. The board members had used their reputations and credentials to exploit the trust of donors who genuinely wanted to help vulnerable children. Their betrayal of that trust deserved consequences that would send a clear message about the accountability of nonprofit leaders and the protection of charitable giving. The law office of Harrison, Mitchell and Associates occupied 3 floors of a prestigious downtown Manhattan building. Its mahogany-paneled conference rooms and leather-bound legal volumes projecting the gravitas I needed for the battle ahead. Catherine Harrison, the senior partner specializing in white-collar criminal defense and nonprofit fraud, had agreed to review my case after my initial phone call describing the scope of Sarah's crimes. Catherine was in her mid-50s with silver hair and penetrating gray eyes that seemed to assess every detail as I presented my evidence. Her reputation for handling complex financial fraud cases was legendary, and her track record of successful prosecutions had made her one of the most sought-after attorneys in the field. Mr. Thompson, she began after reviewing the documents I had compiled, what you've uncovered represents one of the most sophisticated charity fraud schemes I've encountered in 30 years of practice. The evidence you've gathered is comprehensive, well-documented, and extremely damaging to the defendants. She spread the legal brief she had prepared across the conference table, its pages outlining the potential criminal charges and civil remedies available in my case. The legal terminology was complex, but the implications were clear. Sarah and her accomplices faced serious federal charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. The primary charges will be wire fraud and mail fraud, Catherine explained, pointing to specific sections of the brief. These are federal crimes because the defendants used electronic communications and postal services to execute their scheme. Each fraudulent transaction can be charged separately, meaning Sarah alone could face over 40 individual counts. The wire fraud charges carried maximum sentences of 20 years per count, with the possibility of consecutive sentencing that could effectively result in life imprisonment. The mail fraud charges added additional potential penalties, while the conspiracy charges for the board members' participation carried their own severe consequences. We'll also pursue charges under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, Catherine continued. RICO charges are appropriate because this was an ongoing criminal enterprise involving multiple defendants over several years. The penalties under RICO can include asset forfeiture that would help recover stolen funds. The asset forfeiture provisions were particularly important for recovery efforts. Under federal law, prosecutors could seize property purchased with the proceeds of criminal activity, including Sarah's house, her daughter's private school accounts, and the board members' luxury purchases. The seized assets would be liquidated to compensate victims, though Catherine warned that full recovery was unlikely. The civil remedies are equally important, she explained, turning to another section of the brief. We can file a comprehensive lawsuit seeking treble damages, attorney's fees, and punitive awards. The defendant's personal assets would be subject to attachment, and we can pursue their professional liability insurance policies. The complexity of the legal process was daunting. Catherine estimated that criminal prosecution would take 8 to 24 months, while civil litigation could extend for 3 to 5 years. The defendants would hire expensive legal teams, file numerous motions, and use every available tactic to delay proceedings and minimize their exposure. You need to understand that this will consume a significant portion of your time and emotional energy, Catherine warned. The defendants will attack your credibility, your motivations, and your business practices. They'll claim you conducted inadequate due diligence, that you were motivated by tax benefits rather than charitable concerns, and that you bear some responsibility for not detecting the fraud earlier. The personal attacks were inevitable, but painful to contemplate. Sarah and her accomplices would try to shift blame to me, arguing that a sophisticated businessman should have detected their fraud sooner. They would claim that my desire for recognition and tax benefits had made me willfully blind to obvious warning signs. Catherine also explained the challenges of prosecuting nonprofit fraud cases. Juries can be sympathetic to defendants who claim they were trying to help children, even when the evidence shows systematic theft. The defendants will portray themselves as dedicated humanitarians who made mistakes rather than calculated criminals who stole millions. The statute of limitations created additional urgency for filing charges. While the most recent crimes were clearly within the applicable timeframes, some of Sarah's earlier thefts might escape prosecution if we delayed too long. Catherine recommended moving quickly to ensure that all criminal activity could be addressed. The good news is that your evidence is exceptionally strong, she continued. The recorded confession, the financial documentation, the fake program reports, and the social media evidence create an overwhelming case. Defense attorneys will struggle to craft plausible alternative explanations for such comprehensive proof of fraud. The international aspects of the case added complexity but also opened additional avenues for prosecution, because Sarah had claimed to operate programs in multiple countries. Federal prosecutors could pursue charges related to international wire fraud and money laundering. The fake programs in Kenya, Bangladesh, and Guatemala each represented separate criminal acts with their own penalties. Catherine estimated the total cost of legal representation at between $2 million and $3 million, depending on the complexity of the proceedings and the defendant's willingness to negotiate settlements. While the amount was substantial, it represented a small fraction of the stolen funds and was essential for achieving justice. Beyond the financial recovery, this case has broader significance, Catherine noted. Nonprofit fraud undermines public confidence in charitable giving and diverts resources from legitimate organizations addressing real problems. Successful prosecution sends a message that such crimes will be aggressively pursued and severely punished. The decision to pursue prosecution was ultimately mine, but Catherine strongly recommended moving forward. The evidence was compelling, the crimes were serious, and the defendants deserved consequences for their systematic betrayal of public trust. The children who should have been helped deserved justice, even if they would never receive the aid that had been stolen from them. As I signed the retainer agreement, I felt a mixture of determination and trepidation. The legal process would be long, expensive, and emotionally draining, but it was essential for holding Sarah and her accomplices accountable for their crimes. The children whose food money had funded luxury vacations deserved nothing less than complete justice. The attorney's legal brief became a roadmap for the months ahead, outlining the steps necessary to transform my evidence into criminal convictions and civil judgments. The process would test my resolve and resources, but the alternative, allowing the fraud to go unpunished, was unacceptable to someone who had dedicated his success to helping vulnerable children. The FBI field office in Lower Manhattan felt like a fortress of justice as I walked through its security checkpoints, carrying boxes of evidence that would form the foundation of the federal investigation into Sarah's crimes. Special Agent Rebecca Torres, who specialized in nonprofit fraud and financial crimes, had agreed to review my case after Catherine Harrison's recommendation and my initial presentation of evidence. Agent Torres was a 15-year veteran of white crime investigation, with a track record of successful prosecutions in complex financial fraud cases. Her office walls displayed commendations from various law enforcement agencies and photographs from high-profile arrests that had made national news. I felt confident that my case was in capable hands. Mr. Thompson, the evidence you've compiled, it is remarkable in its scope and detail, Agent Torres said as she reviewed the materials I had brought. Most fraud victims come to us with suspicions and fragments of evidence. You've essentially conducted a complete investigation and handed us a prosecution-ready case. The FBI case file that would bear my name was officially opened that afternoon, beginning a federal investigation that would eventually involve dozens of agents forensic accountants, international cooperation requests, and coordination with prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions. The scope of the investigation reflected the complexity of Sarah's crimes and the determination to achieve comprehensive justice. Agent Torres explained the investigation process, which would involve parallel tracks of evidence gathering, witness interviews, financial analysis, and international cooperation. The FBI would verify every aspect of my evidence while building additional support for the criminal charges Catherine had outlined in her legal brief. We'll start by executing search warrants for the Foundation's offices, Sarah's home, and the board members' residences, she explained. These searches will preserve evidence that might otherwise be destroyed and potentially reveal additional crimes or victims. The search warrants were executed simultaneously across multiple locations on a Tuesday morning, ensuring that the defendants couldn't coordinate their responses or destroy evidence. The FBI seized computers, financial records, personal documents, and physical assets that had been purchased with stolen funds. The search of Sarah's Westchester home yielded particularly damaging evidence. Agents found a hidden safe containing cash, jewelry, and documents related to offshore bank accounts that hadn't appeared in the Foundation's official records. The safe also contained detailed files on donors, including psychological profiles and manipulation strategies that revealed the calculated nature of her fraud. Computer forensics specialists recovered deleted emails, financial records, and social media communications that the defendants had attempted to destroy after my confrontation with Sarah. The digital evidence included detailed discussions about covering up the fraud, plans for stealing additional funds, and communications with accomplices who helped launder the stolen money. The international aspects of the investigation required cooperation with law enforcement agencies in Kenya, Bangladesh, Guatemala, and other countries where Sarah had claimed to operate programs. FBI agents worked with Interpol to verify that the supposed program locations didn't exist, and to document the fake testimonials and fabricated reports. Financial forensics teams traced the movement of stolen funds through dozens of accounts, shell companies, and offshore entities. The money trail revealed the sophisticated nature of Sarah's money laundering operation, which had involved banks in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Luxembourg to obscure the sources and destinations of stolen funds. The investigation expanded as agents discovered additional victims who had been defrauded by similar schemes. A retired pharmaceutical executive had donated $5 million after being told it would fund cancer research programs for children in developing countries. An elderly widow had given her late husband's $2 million life insurance payout to support educational programs that existed only in fabricated reports. Each new victim brought additional evidence and charges, creating a comprehensive case that demonstrated the systematic nature of Sarah's criminal enterprise. The FBI documented at least 37 major donors who had been defrauded over 6 years, with total losses exceeding $85 million. Agent Torres introduced me to the federal prosecutor who would handle the case, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen, whose reputation for prosecuting complex financial crimes had earned him respect throughout the legal community. Chen was particularly experienced with RICO cases and international fraud schemes, making him ideally suited for Sarah's prosecution. This case represents everything wrong with nonprofit fraud, Chen told me during our first meeting. The defendants exploited people's charitable instincts to fund luxury lifestyles while children remained hungry. The level of deception and the systematic nature of the crimes demand the harshest possible penalties. The prosecution team was assembled with specialists in financial fraud, international law, and victim advocacy. The case was assigned to a grand jury that would review the evidence and formally issue indictments against Sarah and her accomplices. The grand jury process would take several months, but would result in formal charges that would begin the criminal trial process. My role as the primary cooperating victim required extensive preparation for testimony before the grand jury and eventual trial. I spent hours with prosecutors reviewing the evidence, explaining the investigation techniques I had used, and preparing for the aggressive cross-examination I would face from defense attorneys. The emotional toll of reliving the fraud repeatedly was significant. Each meeting with law enforcement required me to recount the betrayal, explain my trust in Sarah, and acknowledge the mistakes I had made in not detecting the fraud earlier. The process was necessary but painful, forcing me to confront the extent to which I had been manipulated. The investigation also revealed the broader impact of Sarah's crimes on the nonprofit sector. Other charitable organizations had experienced donor skepticism and reduced contributions as news of the fraud spread through philanthropic communities. Legitimate nonprofits addressing childhood hunger had to overcome additional scrutiny and suspicion created by Sarah's betrayal of public trust. As the FBI investigation progressed, the evidence against Sarah and her accomplices became overwhelming. The combination of my initial research, the Bureau's professional investigation, and the cooperation of other victims created a case that defense attorneys would struggle to contest. The documented theft, the systematic deception, and the luxury lifestyle funded by charitable donations created a compelling narrative of greed and betrayal. The FBI case file grew to encompass thousands of pages of evidence, hundreds of witness interviews, and comprehensive financial analysis that traced every dollar of stolen funds. The investigation had become one of the largest nonprofit fraud cases in federal history, attracting attention from law enforcement agencies, legal experts, and advocacy groups focused on protecting charitable giving. Agent Torres assured me that the strength of the evidence and the thoroughness of the investigation made successful prosecution highly likely. The defendants would face overwhelming proof of their crimes, extensive cooperation from victims and witnesses, and federal prosecutors with the resources and expertise necessary to achieve justice. Asterisk. The front-page article in the Wall Street Journal shattered the foundation's carefully constructed facade with a headline that captured the scope of the betrayal: tech entrepreneurs $10 million. Charity donation funded CEO's luxury lifestyle instead of feeding children. The story, which broke on a Wednesday morning, triggered a media firestorm that would expose Sarah's crimes to public scrutiny and forever change how donors approached charitable giving. Jennifer Walsh, the investigative journalist who had covered my company's sale, had been following the story since I first contacted her about the fraud. Her article was meticulously researched, featuring quotes from multiple victims, analysis of the foundation's fraudulent reports, and devastating evidence of Sarah's systematic theft from charitable donations. The media coverage was both validation and violation. After months of private investigation and legal preparation, seeing the truth about Sarah's crimes in print felt like justice beginning to unfold. But the public nature of the exposure also meant reliving the betrayal in front of millions of readers who would judge both Sarah's crimes and my failure to detect them earlier. The article included the photograph of Sarah and me at the donation ceremony, our smiling faces now serving as evidence of successful deception rather than charitable partnership. The image had been reprinted in dozens of publications, creating a visual symbol of how thoroughly she had manipulated my trust and good intentions. By noon, the story had been picked up by every major news organization. CNN ran a segment about nonprofit fraud featuring interviews with other victims, while NBC's Evening News included a detailed breakdown of how the stolen money had been spent. The scope of coverage reflected both the scale of the crimes and the public's fascination with charity fraud involving wealthy donors. Sarah's initial response to the media coverage was predictably defensive and manipulative. Through her attorney, she issued a statement claiming that the foundation's financial irregularities resulted from accounting errors and miscommunications rather than intentional fraud. She portrayed herself as a dedicated humanitarian who had made mistakes while trying to help vulnerable children. Ms. Williams has devoted her life to fighting childhood hunger and poverty, her statement read. While there may have been administrative shortcomings in the foundation's operations, any suggestion of criminal intent is completely unfounded. She looks forward to resolving these misunderstandings and continuing her vital humanitarian work. The statement was carefully crafted to sound plausible while avoiding specific denials that could be used against her in court. But the evidence I had gathered made her claims of innocence laughably implausible. The luxury vacations, the private school tuition, and the expensive lifestyle funded by charitable donations couldn't be explained as accounting errors. The foundation's board members issued their own statements. Through expensive public relations firms hired to manage the crisis, Robert Sterling claimed he had been misled about the foundation's operations, and was shocked to learn about any financial improprieties. Margaret Walsh expressed profound disappointment and claimed she had trusted Sarah's representations about program effectiveness. Their attempts at damage control were undermined by the evidence I had provided to journalists. The board meeting minutes, email communications, and financial records showing their compensation created a clear picture of knowing participation rather than innocent victimization. Their carefully worded denials only highlighted the systematic nature of their deception. The media coverage attracted additional victims who came forward with their own stories of being defrauded by Sarah and her accomplices. A retired teacher in California had donated her entire $300,000 inheritance after being told it would build schools in rural Africa. A successful restaurant owner in Chicago had given $1.2 million to fund medical clinics that existed only in fabricated reports. Each new victim strengthened both the criminal case and the public's understanding of Sarah's systematic targeting of generous donors. The stories revealed a pattern of psychological manipulation that exploited people's deepest values and personal experiences to facilitate theft on an unprecedented scale. The foundation's other staff members, many of whom had been unknowing participants in the fraud, found themselves unemployed and associated with one of the largest charity scandals in recent history. The legitimate employees who had genuinely believed in the foundation's mission were themselves victims of Sarah's deception, though their professional reputations suffered collateral damage. The scandal triggered investigations by state attorneys general in New York, California, and Illinois, where the foundation had solicited donations and claimed to operate programs These investigations expanded the legal pressure on Sarah and her accomplices while creating additional avenues for prosecution and asset recovery. The IRS announced a comprehensive audit of the foundation's tax filings, which could result in additional penalties and the revocation of their tax-exempt status. The agency's investigation would examine not only the fraudulent activities, but also the foundation's failure to file accurate reports and properly manage charitable assets. The media attention also attracted scrutiny from nonprofit watchdog organizations that had previously given the foundation positive ratings. Charity Navigator, GuideStar, and other evaluation services were forced to acknowledge that their assessment methods had failed to detect sophisticated fraud, leading to reviews of their rating criteria and due diligence processes. My decision to go public with the story was controversial within philanthropic circles. Some donors and nonprofit leaders argued that exposing charity fraud would reduce public confidence in legitimate organizations and decrease overall charitable giving. They preferred that such matters be handled quietly to protect the sector's reputation. But I believed that transparency was essential for protecting future donors and holding nonprofit leaders accountable for their actions. The children who should have been helped deserved public acknowledgement of how their aid had been stolen, and other potential victims deserved warning about sophisticated fraud schemes. The personal cost of media exposure was significant. My phone rang constantly with interview requests, my email inbox filled with messages from journalists, and photographers camped outside my home hoping to capture images of the defrauded donor. The attention was overwhelming and invasive, forcing me to hire security and public relations assistants. The coverage also attracted criticism from people who argued that wealthy donors should conduct more thorough due diligence before making large charitable contributions. Some commentators suggested that my failure to detect the fraud earlier indicated carelessness or willful blindness, motivated by tax benefits and social recognition. The criticism stung because it contained elements of truth. I had trusted Sarah's representations without conducting independent verification of the foundation's programs. My desire to help children and my respect for her apparent expertise had made me vulnerable to manipulation that a more skeptical approach might have detected, but the media coverage also generated support from other donors, who recognized that Sarah's fraud was sophisticated, enough to deceive experienced philanthropists and nonprofit professionals. The systematic nature of the deception, the fake websites and documentation, and the involvement of credentialed accomplices had created a fraud scheme that could have fooled almost anyone. The front page physics coverage marked the beginning of a public reckoning with Sarah's crimes that would continue throughout the legal proceedings. The media storm had exposed her fraud to worldwide scrutiny, ensuring that her eventual prosecution would take place under intense public attention that would make any attempt at minimizing her crimes politically impossible. The class action lawsuit filed in federal court represented more than legal strategy. It was a gathering of broken trust, shattered faith, and collective determination to seek justice for crimes that had exploited humanity's best instincts. As the lead plaintiff, I found myself at the center of a growing movement that included 37 other victims whose generosity had been weaponized against vulnerable children. Eleanor Pacheco, an 82-year-old retired nurse from San Diego, had given Sarah her life savings of $480,000 after her husband died of cancer. She had specifically requested that the money fund medical programs for children, hoping to prevent other families from experiencing the devastating loss that had defined her final years. Instead, her donation had funded Sarah's European vacation and her daughter's private tennis lessons. I worked double shifts for 40 years to save that money, Eleanor told me during our first phone conversation. My husband and I planned to travel together in retirement, but cancer took him before we could. I thought giving the money to help sick children would honor his memory. Instead, I funded some stranger's luxury vacation while children are still dying. Her story was heartbreaking but typical of Sarah's targeting strategy. The foundation had identified recent widows through obituary notices and sympathy registrations, then crafted personalized appeals that exploited their grief and desire to create meaningful legacies from their loss. Eleanor had been contacted within 3 months of her husband's death, when her emotional vulnerability was at its peak. Dr. James Morrison, a retired pediatric surgeon from Atlanta, had donated $2.3 million after Sarah convinced him that the foundation's medical programs could prevent the childhood deaths he had fought throughout his career. His donation was supposed to fund mobile medical clinics in rural Guatemala, providing basic health care to children who had no access to medical treatment. I spent my entire career trying to save children's lives, Dr. Morrison explained during a victim meeting in Katherine Harrison's conference room. Sarah showed me photographs of malnourished children who needed exactly the kind of medical intervention I had provided for decades. I thought my donation would multiply my life's work exponentially. The mobile medical clinics existed only in fabricated reports, complete with staged photographs and fictional testimonials. Dr. Morsum's $2.3 million had actually funded Sarah's home renovation, her daughter's semester abroad in France, and a luxury car that sat in her driveway while children in Guatemala remained without medical care. Patricia and Robert Chen, successful restaurateurs from Chicago, had been targeted because of their own immigration story and success in building a family business. Sarah had researched their background extensively, learning about their parents' struggle to establish themselves in America and their commitment to helping other immigrant families achieve similar success. She knew exactly what would motivate us, Patricia explained. She talked about children whose parents had immigrated to escape poverty, just like our families had. She said our donation would fund education programs that would give those children the same opportunities we had been given. The Chen family's $1.8 million donation was supposed to establish scholarship programs and educational support for children of immigrants in Central America. Instead, the money had funded Sarah's investment portfolio and helped purchase the foundation's expensive Manhattan office space that served as a prop for deceiving future donors. The most tragic case involved the Hendricks family from Phoenix, whose 8-year-old daughter had died from complications related to malnutrition. During a medical treatment that had suppressed her immune system, Thomas and Maria Hendricks had donated $900,000 from a malpractice settlement, specifically requesting that the money fund nutrition programs for children undergoing medical treatment. Our daughter Emma died because malnutrition made her too weak to survive her cancer treatment, Maria Hendricks said through tears during a conference call with other victims. We donated the settlement money because we thought we could prevent other families from losing their children the way we lost ours. Finding out that our money funded luxury vacations instead of helping sick children feels like losing Emma all over again. The Hendricks donation had been used to pay for Sarah's daughter's private school tuition and summer camps, creating a particularly cruel irony where money donated to honor a dead child had funded the privileged education of the fraudsters' living daughter. The class action lawsuit unified these individual tragedies into a comprehensive legal strategy that would maximize recovery while minimizing the individual costs of litigation. Catherine Harrison had partnered with victim advocacy specialists to ensure that each donor received appropriate representation and support throughout the legal process. The lawsuit sought not only the return of stolen funds, but also punitive damages that would send a message about the consequences of exploiting charitable intentions. The complaint detailed Sarah's systematic targeting of vulnerable donors, her sophisticated methods of deception, and the psychological manipulation that had enabled such massive theft. The legal document read like an indictment of everything wrong with charity fraud. The defendants identified donors at moments of personal vulnerability: recent widows, parents who had lost children, successful immigrants feeling obligated to help others, and crafted personalized deception strategies that exploited their deepest values and most painful experiences. The formation of our victim advocacy group created unexpected bonds among people who had little in common beyond their shared experience of betrayal. We came from different backgrounds, different generations, and different parts of the country, but we were united by the specific pain of having our generosity exploited to harm the very people we had tried to help. Regular conference calls became support groups where victims could process their anger, shame, and determination to seek justice. Many victims struggled with feelings of responsibility for not detecting the fraud earlier. Despite evidence that Sarah's deception was sophisticated, enough to fool experienced philanthropists and nonprofit professionals, the psychological impact of the fraud extended beyond financial loss to include damaged trust in charitable organizations and reluctance to continue philanthropic giving. Several victims reported that they had stopped donating to any charities, unable to distinguish between legitimate organizations and potential fraud schemes. Eleanor Pacheco's words captured the broader impact. She didn't just steal my money, she stole my faith in helping others. Every time I see a charity appeal now, I wonder if it's another Sarah Williams trying to take advantage of people who just want to make the world a little better. The victim group also served a strategic purpose in the prosecution of Sarah's crimes. Our collective testimony would demonstrate the systematic nature of her fraud, the sophisticated methods she used to target and deceive donors, and the devastating impact of her crimes on both individual victims and the broader nonprofit sector. The class action lawsuit represented more than legal strategy. It was a statement that charitable fraud wouldn't be tolerated, and that people who exploited others' generosity would face consequences severe enough to deter future crimes. The children who should have been helped deserved advocates who wouldn't give up until justice was achieved, regardless of how long or difficult the legal process might prove to be. As we prepared for the long battle ahead, our diverse group of victims had become a unified force committed to ensuring that Sarah's crimes were exposed, punished, and used as a warning to anyone who might consider exploiting humanity's charitable instincts for personal gain. Asterisk. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan had witnessed countless trials, but few cases had attracted the media attention and public interest that surrounded United States v. Williams. The courtroom was packed with journalists, victims, nonprofit advocates, and curious observers drawn by the scope of Sarah's crimes and the sophistication of her deception. Judge Patricia Martinez, a respected federal jurist with 23 years on the bench, presided over proceedings with the gravity that such serious charges demanded. Her courtroom was known for maintaining strict decorum while ensuring that complex financial crimes were explained clearly enough for juries to understand the evidence and reach informed verdicts. Sarah sat at the defendant's table wearing a conservative, navy suit that projected humility and remorse, a carefully calculated image designed to contrast with the luxury lifestyle that prosecutors would document throughout the trial. Her defense team, led by prominent white-collar criminal attorney David Sterling, had prepared a strategy that would attempt to minimize her culpability while portraying her as a well-intentioned humanitarian who had made tragic mistakes. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen, was devastating in its simplicity and clarity. "This case is about greed disguised as charity," he told the 12 jurors who would decide Sarah's fate. The defendants systematically stole millions of dollars donated to feed hungry children and used that money to fund luxury vacations, private school tuition, and an extravagant lifestyle. Chen's presentation included a PowerPoint timeline that traced my $10 million donation from the moment I signed the check through its rapid dispersal into Sarah's personal accounts and shell companies. The visual evidence was compelling, showing exactly how money intended for starving children had been converted into personal luxury within days of being donated. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. FBI forensic accountants testified about the complex money laundering schemes, while computer specialists explained how fake websites and fraudulent reports had been created to deceive donors. The evidence was technical but devastating, creating an undeniable picture of systematic criminal activity. My testimony as the lead victim was the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. I spent 3 days on the witness stand, explaining my investigation, playing the recorded confession, and detailing how Sarah had exploited my personal history to facilitate her theft. The jury listened intently as I described the betrayal of trust and the impact on children who remained hungry while she lived in luxury. "Mr. Thompson," Prosecutor Chen asked during direct examination, "when you made this donation, what did you believe would happen to your money?" "I believed it would save children's lives," I replied, looking directly at the jury. "I thought hungry children would be fed, that families would learn sustainable farming techniques, that communities would become self-sufficient. Instead, the money paid for luxury vacations while those children remained hungry." Sarah's defense attorney attempted to portray me as a careless donor who had failed to conduct proper due diligence before making such a large gift. During cross-examination, he questioned my business judgment and suggested that my desire for tax benefits and social recognition had made me willfully blind to obvious warning signs. "Mr. Thompson, isn't it true that you made this donation without visiting any program sites or independently verifying the foundation's claims?" Sterling asked aggressively. "I trusted someone who presented herself as a dedicated humanitarian," I responded. "I trusted fabricated reports, stolen photographs, and fake testimonials that were created specifically to deceive donors." The sophistication of her fraud was designed to fool experienced philanthropists. The defense strategy became clear as the trial progressed. Sarah's attorneys argued that she had been overwhelmed by the foundation's rapid growth and had made increasingly desperate decisions to maintain funding for legitimate programs. They portrayed her personal expenses as temporary borrowing that she had intended to repay once the foundation's finances stabilized. But the prosecution's evidence made this defense implausible. The luxury lifestyle, the systematic money laundering, and the complete fabrication of program reports demonstrated calculated theft rather than desperate borrowing. Sarah's recorded confession, where she admitted that the programs didn't exist and the money was gone, destroyed any remaining credibility for her defense strategy. Other victims testified about their own experiences with Sarah's deception, creating a pattern of systematic targeting and manipulation that spanned multiple years. Eleanor Pacheco's testimony about donating her life savings was particularly powerful, as she described how Sarah had exploited her grief to steal money intended to honor her deceased husband. Dr. James Morrison's testimony about the fake medical programs was devastating to Sarah's claims of good intentions. As a pediatric surgeon, he had asked detailed technical questions about the supposed medical interventions, and Sarah had provided elaborate but completely fictional answers that demonstrated her willingness to lie about life-saving medical care. The board members' trials were being conducted separately, but their recorded communications were admitted as evidence in Sarah's case. The emails showing their awareness of the fraud and their discussions about covering it up eliminated any possibility that Sarah could claim she had acted alone or without sophisticated accomplices. Sarah's daughter Emma was called as a witness by the defense, in a desperate attempt to humanize the defendant and show the impact that conviction would have on her family. The 18-year-old testified about her mother's dedication to charitable work and expressed confusion about the charges, claiming she had believed the family's lifestyle was funded by her mother's legitimate salary. But Emma's testimony backfired. When prosecutors established that her private school tuition European semester abroad, and luxury possessions had all been funded directly by stolen charitable donations. The contrast between her privileged lifestyle and the poverty of children who should have been helped created exactly the kind of emotional impact that would motivate jury conviction. The prosecution's closing argument focused on the children, who had been betrayed by Sarah's crimes. Chen displayed photographs of genuinely malnourished children, alongside images of Sarah's luxury vacations, creating a visual representation of the choice she had made between helping vulnerable children and funding her own pleasure. The defendant made a choice, Chen told the jury in his final statement. She chose luxury over life, vacation over virtue, greed over generosity. Every dollar she stole was a meal not provided to a hungry child, a medical treatment not given to a sick child, an education not offered to a child who deserved better. The defense's closing argument attempted to generate sympathy for Sarah by emphasizing her previous charitable work and the financial pressures she had faced as the foundation grew, but the evidence of systematic fraud, combined with her recorded confession and the testimony of multiple victims, made arguments for mitigation rather than acquittal. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all 43 counts of wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and their disgust with crimes that had exploited charitable intentions to harm vulnerable children. As the foreman read the verdict, Sarah collapsed in her chair. Finally, understanding that her elaborate web of lies had been completely exposed, the woman who had manipulated my trust to steal millions would now face decades in federal prison. Her crimes documented in court transcripts that would serve as a permanent record of her betrayal. The conviction was just the first step in a longer process of justice and recovery, but it represented a crucial acknowledgement that Sarah's crimes were serious, systematic, and deserving of severe punishment. The children who should have been helped had finally received some measure of justice, even if they would never benefit from the aid that had been stolen from them. The sentencing hearing took place on a cold February morning, 18 months after Sarah's conviction on 43 federal felony counts. Judge Martinez's courtroom was again filled with victims, media representatives, and observers who had followed the case through its lengthy legal proceedings. The moment we had all waited for, the formal consequences for Sarah's systematic betrayal, was finally at hand. Sarah sat at the defendant's table wearing an orange jumpsuit from the federal detention center where she had been held since her conviction. The designer clothes and carefully crafted image were gone, replaced by the stark reality of someone who had been convicted of massive financial crimes and faced the prospect of spending the remainder of her productive years in federal prison. The sentencing guidelines for Sarah's crimes called for a term of 240 to 300 months, essentially life sentence for someone in her mid-40s. The scope of her theft, the systematic nature of her deception, and the vulnerability of her victims had all contributed to the severe recommended punishment. Judge Martinez had discretion to impose sentences within or outside the guidelines, but precedent suggested that such massive charity fraud would receive the harshest possible penalty. Victim impact statements preceded the formal sentencing, giving those who had been defrauded the opportunity to address Sarah directly and explain how her crimes had affected their lives. Eleanor Pacheco, now 84 and using a walker, spoke first about the devastating impact of losing her life savings to someone she had trusted to honor her deceased husband's memory. "You stole more than my money," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You stole my faith in humanity, my ability to trust people who claim to help others, and my chance to create something meaningful from my husband's death. I will never understand how someone could look at suffering children and see only an opportunity for personal profit." Dr. James Morrison spoke about the professional betrayal he felt as a physician who had dedicated his career to saving children's lives. "You exploited my life's work to fund your luxury lifestyle," he said. "Every child I couldn't save during my medical career deserved better than having their memory used to justify theft from other vulnerable children." My own victim impact statement focused on the broader implications of Sarah's crimes for charitable giving and public trust in nonprofit organizations. "Your fraud didn't just steal money from individual donors," I told her. "You damaged the entire system of charitable giving that helps vulnerable people throughout the world. Every dollar stolen makes other donors more suspicious, other charities less trusted, and other children less likely to receive help." Sarah's defense attorney presented mitigation evidence focusing on her difficult childhood, financial pressures, and claims of mental health issues that had contributed to her criminal behavior. Character witnesses testified about her previous charitable work and described her as someone who had genuinely cared about helping children before being overwhelmed by the foundation's growth and financial demands. But the mitigation evidence was undermined by the systematic nature of Sarah's crimes and the sophistication of her deception. The fake websites, stolen photographs, fabricated testimonials, and complex money laundering schemes demonstrated calculated criminal activity rather than desperate mistakes made under pressure. Sarah's own statement to the court was a carefully crafted apology that attempted to express remorse while minimizing her culpability. "I deeply regret the pain I have caused to donors who trusted me with their generosity," she said. "I never intended to hurt children or betray the confidence of people who wanted to make the world better. I take full responsibility for my actions and ask for mercy so that I can someday make amends for the mistakes I have made." The statement felt hollow and manipulative, lacking the genuine accountability that might have generated some sympathy from victims or the court. Sarah's inability to fully acknowledge the calculated nature of her crimes suggested that she still didn't understand the magnitude of her betrayal or accept complete responsibility for its consequences. Judge Martinez's sentencing decision was both comprehensive and severe. She sentenced Sarah to 312 months in federal prison, 26 years, that would effectively end her career and consume most of her remaining productive life. The sentence exceeded the guidelines maximum, reflecting the judge's determination to send a clear message about the consequences of charity fraud. "The defendant's crimes represent a profound betrayal of public trust," Judge Martinez said as she announced the sentence. "Charitable giving represents humanity at its best, people using their success to help those who are suffering. The defendant perverted that generosity into a criminal enterprise that stole from vulnerable children while funding luxury that those children will never experience." The judge also ordered restitution of $47 million, representing the total amount stolen from all victims, plus interest and penalties. While the restitution order was largely symbolic, Sarah's assets had already been seized and liquidated. It created a permanent legal obligation that would follow her for the rest of her life. Asset forfeiture proceedings had already recovered approximately $12 million through the sale of Sarah's house, cars, jewelry, and other luxury items purchased with stolen funds. The recovered money would be distributed among victims proportionally, though it represented less than 15% of the total theft. The board members received their own severe sentences in separate proceedings. Robert Sterling was sentenced to 156 months for his role in developing the money laundering systems and recruiting other accomplices. Margaret Walsh received 108 months for her participation in the conspiracy and her use of her family foundation's reputation to provide credibility for the fraud. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, whose medical credentials had been essential for legitimizing the fake health programs, was sentenced to 84 months and barred from serving on any nonprofit board for life. Her fall from respected medical professional to convicted felon demonstrated how charity fraud could destroy even distinguished careers and reputations. The foundation itself was formally dissolved, its remaining assets seized to compensate victims. The Manhattan office was closed, the staff dismissed, and the organization's tax-exempt status permanently revoked. The Children's Hope Foundation ceased to exist, becoming a cautionary tale about the importance of nonprofit oversight and donor due diligence. The criminal convictions also triggered civil liability for professional malpractice insurance carriers, auditing firms that had provided fake legitimacy, and financial institutions that had failed to detect obvious money laundering activities. These additional recoveries would eventually provide some compensation to victims. Though full recovery remained unlikely, the sentences represented justice for the children who should have been helped and vindication for the donors who had been systematically deceived. But they also highlighted the broader challenge of preventing sophisticated charity fraud and protecting the system of charitable giving that helps vulnerable people throughout the world. As I left the courthouse after Sarah's sentencing, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but at an enormous cost to individual victims, to public trust in charitable organizations, and to the children who remained hungry while stolen money had funded luxury lifestyles. The prison sentence document in my files represented the end of one chapter in a longer story about trust, betrayal, and the responsibility that comes with success. Sarah would spend the next 26 years contemplating the consequences of her crimes, but the real work of rebuilding trust and helping vulnerable children was just beginning. The new foundation charter sat on my desk like a phoenix rising from the ashes of betrayal. 27 pages of legal documentation that would transform my painful experience with Sarah's fraud into a force for genuine change. The Marcus Thompson Foundation for Child Nutrition would honor my original intentions while incorporating every lesson learned from being systematically deceived by someone I had trusted completely. 2 years had passed since Sarah's sentencing, and the long process of rebuilding my faith in charitable giving had culminated in creating an organization that would serve as a model for transparency, accountability, and effective philanthropy. The Foundation's charter included revolutionary oversight mechanisms designed to prevent the kind of fraud that had stolen millions from children who desperately needed help. Every program funded by the new foundation would be subject to independent verification by third-party monitoring organizations with no financial relationship to the implementing partners. GPS tracking would document the exact locations of all program activities, while blockchain technology would create immutable records of how every donated dollar was spent and what outcomes it achieved. The foundation's board included Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a pediatric nutrition specialist from Johns Hopkins who would personally visit every program site quarterly; James Rodriguez, a former Peace Corps director with 30 years of international development experience, would oversee program implementation and verify that reported outcomes matched actual results; Elena Basquez, a forensic accountant who had worked on several major fraud investigations, would conduct ongoing financial audits to detect any irregularities before they could become systematic problems. Unlike Sarah's fabricated reports, our documentation would include real-time video feeds from program sites, direct communication with beneficiaries, and independent verification of every claim made in donor communications. Transparency wouldn't just be promised, it would be built into every aspect of the foundation's operations through technology that made deception impossible, rather than unlikely. The first program we funded was a nutrition center in rural Kenya, chosen specifically because it represented the kind of direct intervention that Sarah had claimed to operate while actually stealing money for luxury vacations. I traveled to the site personally, accompanied by Dr. Mitchell and a documentary crew that would create ongoing video records of the program's impact. The contrast with Sarah's lies was profound and moving. Real children received nutritious meals, prepared in a real kitchen by real local staff who were genuinely committed to improving their community's health outcomes. The children's faces, bright with health and hope, represented everything that should have happened with my original donation to Sarah's fraudulent foundation. 8-year-old Grace Wanjiku had been severely malnourished when the program began. 6 months earlier, her transformation was documented in medical records, photographs, and video footage that showed her progression from a listless, underweight child to an energetic student who attended school regularly and performed well academically. Her story represented the kind of impact that donors imagined when they made charitable gifts. Before the nutrition program, Grace was too weak to walk to school, explained her teacher, Mary Kamau. Now she's one of our best students, always eager to learn and help other children. Proper nutrition didn't just save her life, it gave her the energy to build a future. The program was feeding 847 children daily, providing not just meals but nutrition, education for families, and sustainable farming training for community members. The total cost was $180,000 annually, a fraction of what Sarah had stolen for a single luxury vacation. The efficiency and impact were exactly what effective philanthropy could achieve when properly managed and honestly implemented. Our expansion to Guatemala followed the same rigorous verification process. The community leaders who partnered with our foundation underwent background checks, provided references from other development organizations, and agreed to comprehensive monitoring that would continue throughout the program's operation. The educational initiatives we funded were photographed, videotaped, and independently verified by education specialists who had no financial stake in reporting positive outcomes. The foundation's website featured live streams from program sites, real-time financial reporting, and direct communication tools that allowed donors to speak with beneficiaries and community leaders. This level of transparency was unprecedented in international development, creating a new standard for accountability that other organizations began adopting. But the foundation's work extended beyond direct programming to include advocacy for donor protection and charity fraud prevention. We partnered with law enforcement agencies to develop training materials for investigating nonprofit fraud, provided resources to help other donors conduct proper due diligence, and supported legislation that would strengthen oversight of charitable organizations. The Donor Protection Act, which we helped draft and lobby for passage, required enhanced reporting from large nonprofits, created criminal penalties for specific types of charity fraud, and established victim compensation funds, supported by penalties imposed on convicted fraudsters. The legislation was named in honor of Eleanor Pacheco, whose life savings had been stolen by Sarah's scheme. Eleanor, now 86, attended the bill signing ceremony at the White House, where she met other victims who had become advocates for protecting charitable giving. Her presence represented the resilience of people who had been betrayed but refused to let that betrayal destroy their commitment to helping others. Sarah Williams stole my money, but she couldn't steal my desire to help children, Eleanor said during her speech at the ceremony. This law will protect other donors from the kind of deception that nearly destroyed my faith in humanity. The foundation's impact grew rapidly as donors who had been hesitant to give after learning about charity fraud found confidence in our transparent approach. Within 3 years, we were operating programs in 12 countries, serving over 25,000 children, and demonstrating that effective philanthropy was possible when proper safeguards prevented fraud and ensured accountability. The children we helped began sending letters and videos expressing their gratitude. Real communications from real beneficiaries whose lives had been genuinely transformed by charitable giving. These messages were shared with donors, creating the kind of meaningful connection that Sarah had faked through fabricated testimonials and stolen photographs. My personal transformation was as significant as the foundation's institutional impact. The naive trust that had made me vulnerable to Sarah's manipulation had been replaced by informed skepticism, balanced with renewed commitment to helping vulnerable children. I had learned to verify rather than simply trust, to demand evidence rather than accept promises, and to build systems that prevented fraud rather than hoping it wouldn't occur. The betrayal that had once shattered my faith in humanity had ultimately strengthened my commitment to using success responsibly. Sarah's crimes had taught me that effective philanthropy required more than good intentions, and generous gifts had demanded rigorous oversight, transparent operations, and constant vigilance against those who would exploit charitable impulses for personal gain. The foundation charter that now governed our operations represented more than legal documentation. It was a commitment to the children who deserved better than the lies Sarah had told about helping them. Every safeguard we implemented, every verification process we required, and every transparent report we published honored their memory while protecting future beneficiaries from similar betrayal. I watched video footage of children in our programs, learning, growing, and thriving with proper nutrition. I felt the satisfaction that had been stolen by Sarah's fraud finally restored. These children were receiving the help that my original donation should have provided, proving that betrayal didn't have to be permanent, and that trust could be rebuilt through accountability and genuine commitment to charitable missions. The Marcus Thompson Foundation for Child Nutrition would continue expanding its work, serving as both a model for effective philanthropy and a memorial to the children who should have been helped but were instead betrayed by someone who saw their suffering as an opportunity for personal profit. Their lives mattered, their needs were real, and their futures would be brighter because we had learned from Sarah's crimes rather than being paralyzed by them.